one of those episodes that I think has informed my thinking, but I'm actually not sure because I don't remember.
Yeah. If anybody asks, you'd say, "Oh yes, I read this thing."
Oh yes, the gender sphere. I know all about the gender sphere. I remember making that joke, I think, a lot at the episode.
Okay. Hey, well, classic case of my not remembering something that we've read and spoken about on this podcast.
Well, yeah, you're going to run the club. All right, Dan, before we get started, podcast news. Aside from our usual end of summer hiatus, where we usually take anywhere between, I don't know, a few weeks, like a month off. I will say the first time we did this, the first few years, I think when we took our hiatus, we like planned it out so that we never missed an episode. I remember we watched movies, we'd do that, we'd read things in advance. That ain't happening.
Well, the first year we banked so much. Yeah, I think in that first year, that was when we finished reading was it The Devil's Chessboard, that book? We finished reading that book, and then we recorded like a 5-hour podcast, which ended up getting split into 2 episodes. 5 hours talking about the last third of that book. But I mean, it merited it all.
I mean, we figured it out. We figured it all out. You know, we used some pseudo history. We figured it all out.
Yeah.
Also, we were recording one every week, which is insane for like a long time. Also, didn't have jobs at that time. COVID, so what are you going to do? It made it a lot easier. So yeah, aside from that usual break, which we're going to do, bit of news is that me and my partner are expecting a baby here in a week and a half, which is pretty insane. I probably shouldn't be podcasting this close to that. I should probably be spending time with my partner. Not doing that. We had to get at least one more out. And because of that, Dan has accepted my paternity leave application for the podcast. So we're going to take a hiatus from the show for a little while. First time we've ever done anything like this. In 6 years, coming up on 6 years, which is insane. I doubt it's going to be altogether that long. It will probably be at a minimum, probably a month or two, I would imagine. And then the schedule from there will depend on the baby itself and what this baby winds up being like. From everything I've heard, newborns, you can just kind of like leave them alone and they're fine. So, you know, it should be fine. Who knows? I'm sure I can get back to podcasting soon. But that's the podcasting news. This will be the last one for a while. And hence why we're returning to some stuff on the family, to get my learning in before we start a family of our own, which is an insane thing to say. So that's the news. Before we get to the reading, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is what a baby born in 2026 is kind of going to make of the world. You know what I mean? And I would be interested to get your take on this, because I feel like, you know, I was born in the 90s and there was a definite moment, I feel like, probably mainly applicable to my own political, like, you know, radicalization and stuff. But there was a definite moment where I think I realized, it was also probably just when I became an adult and was forced off my family's health insurance and had to get a job and had to pay rent, where I was like, oh, things actually don't seem to be on just like a permanent march upward. You know what I mean? Whereas I feel like for generations, I don't know, depending on who you are, depending on what your socioeconomic status was, there was this promise of capitalism always getting better. And it kind of hit me where I was like, you know, downward mobility is a real thing. But I feel like for a baby being born potentially next week, you know what I mean? It's like, I wonder how they're going to kind of perceive of, you know, the end of history, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I guess also, I guess some of it's a zeitgeist question, right? It's like, what is the mood of the society? Obviously, we were perhaps born into a different sort of. Well, I guess I can't remember how much younger you are than me, but yeah, I was just on the sort of tail end of the kind of like, well, in the UK, the kind of like the boom in the early 2000s and the sort of like success of the first new Labour government, and I think I still had a little bit of the prospect of like, perhaps my generation had the prospect of, you go to university, you get a job, and the economy's doing really well. And then 2008 happened. I mean, I'm not sure whether my aspirations were ever really that well attuned, or, you know.
Yeah, it's good to say same for me.
So we maybe have to speak in generalities, but yeah. So I guess it sort of depends what the developing zeitgeist is going to be. It's going to be quite hard to escape Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, I suppose. Like, if you're of a generation which sort of transitions a boundary between optimism into a more pessimistic era, maybe that sort of feeling of pessimism is more acute or more damaging or more impactful, kind of thing. Whereas if you're born into it, it might not be experienced as pessimism at all. It might.
Mm,
I don't know.
yeah.
Um,
I think I was just thinking about this because the other day I saw a photo of the like main city down here, the downtown in probably like 30 years ago or something like that. And then I saw a series of them like 100 years ago, right? Or actually a little bit before that because it was before the revolution, but like it was just like there were no empty buildings. Like
mhm.
there was public transit, you know, you don't want to read too much into like historical photos or whatever because who knows what the context was with them, but it's just like green spaces. I mean, obviously out here, Ireland, like abandoned buildings and shit is like a huge issue. And the use of buildings and stuff like that. So that probably makes it a bit more extreme, but it's also just like exactly like what you say. It's like, y- you know, if you and I are in the same generation, our generation definitely saw people not too much older than us go to college and get a job that they wanted. And now it's just like, even if you want to just be like an asshole consultant, it's like your options are pretty limited, to obviously say nothing of like, I don't know, how racialized things are in America and obviously in Europe too. But yeah, I feel like the UK specifically hasn't really ever come to terms with this, at least in its cultural public zeitgeist. Maybe people are now, but it does feel like, obviously America has the like salute the flag, everything's great. America's the best in every aspect of culture. Baseball game, you have to salute the flag, anything public, but like, maybe I'm just talking myself into there actually not being that much of a difference between the UK and America, but we'll see. I think I'm just
I'm,
saying it's like
I'm
if you're
interested.
born now, it's like, there was a part of me before that believed in like, hey, if I just go to college, I'll be fine. It's like, not the case.
It's a pretty cool, pretty sort of slightly radical about face for me. But I don't know whether you saw any of I've forgotten our new prime minister's name, Andy Burnham.
Not
If you
West
saw any of
Streeting.
any
Yep.
of Andy Burnham's sort of like first speech on taking on the prime ministership of the United Kingdom,
I
but
didn't actually.
yeah, no, I was just like there were a few things that caught me about it, like his seemed to be painting like almost painting this idea of the UK being diminished in the eyes of the world to some extent, and sort of like needing to have its uh, image rehabilitated or something. Maybe I'm misremembering or misspeaking, but it sort of like chimed a little bit with what you're saying about like the maybe a disconnect between um, America's kind of like sense of its own superiority. I'm not sure how much that actually holds in the minds of regular Americans. I'm sure there's a big divide between people, kind of thing. And then also that just like slightly disappointingly, like the degree of ambition that Andy Burnham seemed to set himself around the languages around like making people feel just a little bit more hopeful, just a little bit of hope would be enough to like um, satisfy people's dissatisfaction. However, we want to conceptualize that there is this. A lot of people feel like Britain doesn't work or the system doesn't work very well, or which is certainly true in a lot of respects. But yeah, maybe it's another aspect of the zeitgeist that we're being your child is going to be born into, this sort of feeling of a failing state or failing just capacity in general or ability to achieve anything.
Yeah. 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 Because I mean, I'm not going to act like that ideology is the thing that makes people revolt or anything like that. But you would certainly imagine the base level of openness towards rebellion or something like that as being greater, perhaps with a generation that just never had any like, liberal hopes that I certainly had, like when I was in high school or in college or whatever, that it was all just like this rapidly improving world, and I mean, there's still people that believe this shit. Like, we see the way anybody talks about AI or something like that. But yeah, yeah, it's just funny. The I keep almost calling him West Streeting. Andy Burnham. I do like that It's like he wasn't even sworn in or whatever as prime minister, and he immediately was like, we're probably going to open up the North Sea to more drilling. It's like, dude, become prime minister before you go back on that promise. Like, oh my god.
No.
Yeah, well, actually, one more thing I want to say on that is that I feel like the kind of Britain being diminished, the UK being diminished in people's eyes, I feel like that frequently is just a nod towards increased militarism, ideologically at least.
I mean,
and yeah, all I would say is that for America, there's never been a time where its militarism has been on a downward slope. So perhaps in the UK there is a difference there where it's like, don't worry, we're going to get our mitts back into things and we're going to start meddling again. Maybe not, but that's always what it feels like to me.
That's the troubling thing about it, right? Is actually, well, it's in two respects. Like, it's the criticism that comes from the Trump administration about other NATO allies not spending enough money on defense, and then it's also this sort of like rising fear that's true or untrue that's being stoked around, the enemies of NATO, Russia and China, and global threats of that nature. It's sort of like the underlying tone of that is Britain looks soft and we need to like toughen up somehow. So let's have a new chancellor who really wants to spend lots of money on the military, I guess, seems to be the Andy Burnham strategy. But
yeah, and in terms of
we're supposed to feel good because at least he's willing to spend money. But
yeah, hey, at least he's willing to spend, man. If that just means, a huge mega industrial complex for Elbit systems, then, what are you going to do? It is also just interesting seeing the way that someone who's like painting themselves not as like a social democrat by any means, but it's someone that's like left of center now, what that passes for, because it's like, obviously we've spoken before about how you just can't keep your job if you're a prime minister in the UK anymore because just nothing's working. But like the big plan being £2 bus fares, and then it's just like immediately it comes out that where they're getting the money to do that from is from like gutting aid budgets to like the poorest people in the UK. It's like, oh my god, it's like you can't do anything.
I didn't know that was I wasn't where they got the money from. I'd just seen that headline. I mean, it's funny, like Andy Burnham's the bus guy, so he's got to do something. Yeah. I mean, does anybody...
I thought Nigel Farage was the bus... Oh, no, who was the bus guy? Boris Johnson was the bus guy. I mean, he was the guy who went around with the bus.
Yeah.
Must have the same consultants. Yeah. Oh, Jesus. Oh, well. Well, all right, Hope. Let's see. Hope, what are you going to do? This kid. Yeah. If this kid ever listens to this, it'll all be fine. Don't worry about it. It's all good. You're being poured into a great time.
All the cloud server's going to last that long. I don't really know.
yeah, exactly. Who knows how long this is going to last?
This is all going to get erased to run some kind of AI at some point, I'm sure.
or even more grim, being used to train AI. How to misinterpret marks. Oh, actually,
go on.
On that note, there's something I keep forgetting to tell you. I'll tell you after the podcast. Something very funny,
okay,
in relation to that. Anyways, okay, let's get into talking about this thing. Ostensibly, communist, about to be a parent. What do I need to do? Step number 1: read some Alexandra Kollontai. So we're reading Communism in the Family, which was written in 1920, which is an interesting time for that. Like, again, I feel like whenever we read anything from the main actors of the Russian Revolution, it's so like fascinating to get bits of writing at very specific points. Like we've spoken before about how interesting it was to compare the State and Revolution to Renegade Kautsky, as those were written not too far apart, but like far enough apart for the rapid, swell of the revolution to like make them mean something very different. Or for their context to be very different. This is one I think that is similar. It's something that when we were talking about reading it, I was kind of like, I didn't I didn't bother going to read it beforehand. So I was like, it'll be interesting to see how progressive this winds up coming across, because you'd imagine like 1920, like who knows if a communist is talking about the family, who knows what that could mean. When we read that Emmy O'Brien piece in Endnotes about family abolishment, the main point of her thing was kind of just to show that like that phrase has meant something so different throughout different revolutions and different periods in capitalism's history. And I was really interested to see what this was going to wind up being like. I think a lot of people would take a lot of this stuff for granted. A lot of people understand this stuff, but like a lot of it is much more pertinent now than when she was writing. And I was impressed, is what I'll say. I was impressed with how progressive this wound up coming across.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Maybe I was felt a little differently to some extent. Maybe I sort of read this as a propaganda piece, to some extent, which is what it seems to be, right? It seems to be designed in some ways to allay the fears of, bourgeois women to some extent, or subjects of capitalism, the proletariat, who might be fearful of what communism might mean for both their sort of the basic survival of the conditions of existence of women, but also like the continued structures of child rearing. I felt like it sort of like does betray some of the sort of like maybe like ideological fixations of the Bolsheviks in terms of development, in terms of stages and modes of production. Sort of like this, sort of like it's almost making what capitalism has done to the existence of the family into a sort of necessary stage in the development of, I don't know, the familial structure and the way it relates to society, in almost a sort of teleological way. I felt like it was I felt like it was kind of like reveling in a certain amount of developmentalism or a certain fixation on industrialization, sort of ideas around building a proletarian subject that was very closely aligned with, I guess, the productivist working class kind of thing. So in some ways, I felt like it was setting up a slightly ideological framework which valorized some of those things. Not that these are things we can talk about or not. I don't know necessarily how I feel about that, but like what I sort of felt like that was doing was, or I feel like one could read this as a kind of like glorification or an acceptance of what capitalism had done to the family, and rather than, I mean, obviously it's offering sort of the relation, the sort of like a set of solutions that are sort of like state communist almost, as the answer. But in some ways, I felt like that could easily be read as a kind of like, and maybe I just accidentally read it as a kind of almost abolish the family, or like a desire to move beyond, in a kind of like almost accelerationist way, move beyond the family, rather than, I don't know, ask people what they want almost, or like look to what needs to be salvaged, what doesn't. I felt like it didn't leave very much open, but rather sort of claim to have a lot of answers about what should be done.
Well, I think that's also that's just like the main critique of the Bolshevik movement, right? And about like the specific revolutionary conditions of, 1917, 1920 Russia becoming the Soviet Union, right? Which was this very much like workerist movement. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm very glad you mentioned that. I will say, I think that what she's doing, you can definitely read it two ways, because there's a lot of stuff in here where she talks about the communist state as being the thing that's going to, sort out all this family stuff. We'll talk more about that, I think, here in a second. But she seems to be using these phrases like state and about family in kind of two different ways, where it's like the state comes across as, it could mean the Bolshevik party, right? It could mean this big growing into an authoritarian thing that guides, maybe not authoritarian, but like paternalistic thing that guides workers into the direction that they know is best. But then she also seems to be using the word state in a different way, which is just like collective society. And I think kind of that gets to the point that I think you're kind of saying, which is a critique of probably just like social democracy in general, right? Which is like verging on a teleological acceptance of kind of like what capitalism has done, but making it more rational, which I think is definitely what she's doing as it relates to the family. But what I would say is, I think you're right to say that she's writing this for the purpose of a propaganda piece to kind of assuage people's fears. I think the fears that she's trying to assuage are less so for like bourgeois women and more so just for like men in a lot of ways, where it's like men seeing women suddenly coming into the workplace, which again gets to your critique of like, yay, communism, when we're all workers in the factory, which is like perhaps not the brand of communism that we like appreciate. But, she is, as with all of these pieces in the Russian Revolution, attempting to justify events in motion. And I think this was a very good way of doing that and can be read perhaps with a little bit of hindsight bias that I should probably point out as something much more progressive. But she is definitely just trying to justify, like, women not just staying at home all day while man is the one breadwinner, right? Like, you know, you could read this as something that is a bit more questioning of what even is a family, as opposed to, well, capitalism's destroyed it, so now let's all be workers, but maybe not. That's how who knows.
Yeah, I mean, there is an element to which this is defined. Another way in which it's defined by the time that it's written, and I suppose the country that it's written in to some extent. Like, obviously, this is before the mid 20th century boom in social democracy, and at the point where the kind of like, particularly Russia's just gone through this massive phase of industrialization that we would have seen in the west of Europe, like 50 to 100 years before, kind of thing. This process of destruction of the traditional family, which to some extent for Kollontai is almost like the feudal family arrangement, and we should get onto that in a minute. But like this process of a social life for people that's sort of like defined around a family unit. She's almost describing a process where that's been made completely untenable by capitalism, without capitalism like putting in place any kind of alternative. There almost isn't a capitalist version of the family as of yet, I suppose, emergent in this historical process. We're at a point where it's just seemingly destroying everything, and she in parts of this creates quite a sort of apocalyptic image of like both parents in the factory all the time. And obviously this is a situation that did happen, right? But like parents in the workplace, in the factory all the time, and children having to go off to work very young as well. And then even before that, children being sort of starved of the nurture and upbringing of their parents, and rather being left to the streets to fend for themselves and have this kind of like have an education that's sort of predicated on that I don't know, solitude or abandonment to the ravages of the world, kind of thing. But yeah, as I say, like I think it's defined by being written in that point in history, kind of thing. And obviously, what we now know, European social democracy developed into, particularly after the Second World War, but even before that, sort of like it is a period of history that she was obviously unaware of, when she wrote this.
Well, I mean, again, that just gets into what we've talked about before about like trying not to fetishize any one organizational form that worked at one point, which, you can't really like, I'm just saying that because it's like, seemed like it was working to them. Obviously like Jan Appel was over in Holland or something, like, attempting to steal a boat to get to Lenin to tell him why it's not going to work. But like, these people were communists, I mean? Like they were trying, like they did think this was the way things had to work. I think that bit that you hit on is perhaps what came across as the most prescient to me, because this is something that is even more indicative and important to our times to really try and understand our current kind of like environmental situation when it comes to kind of like how we act as organizers. And that's specifically the idea that she gets to about how capitalism is the thing. There's a bit of an uncomfortable bit here. You're right, where she's kind of like, oh, well, actually, communists aren't the ones destroying the family. Capitalism has already destroyed the family. And there's a way of reading that, which is just entirely true. And like the most important part of that she's saying, which is like, this is the teleological development of capitalism towards socialism, is something that we're still dealing with now, which is just that you can't have one wage earner in a household really at all, right? Like we'll get into kind of like the more feudal petty commodity production stuff here in a second, how that family was actually structured. But there isn't anyone that I know that is able to have a family, which is to say like, a typical nuclear family, like two people perhaps raising an unnumbered amount of children, right? You can't really just do that and just have one income. Like it's just impossible. And increasingly it's becoming more and more impossible to have just two average wages and attempt to do that, right? We just looked at fucking daycare prices. for when we run out of leave and we have to figure out what to do with with this small human. It's like $1,000 a month. We were just like, what? Like, who's paying for that? What the fuck? So anyway, come back to me in 6 months when we have to figure that one out. But I mean, this is something that I don't begrudge Kollontai for not realizing, but as that development is, unfolded over the past 100 years since she wrote this, like this idea of the loss of the single earner household, the kind of like patriarchal, like male controlled wage, like as that's disappeared, you start to see people like not just questioning the family because they have to, but you start to question like how it is that we perform gender or even like identify, right? And I think that's probably the thing that I was most kind of surprised to see in here, just because I don't really know anything about these debates that happened back then, right? What little reading we've done on the family before has been fairly contemporary. But it was just very interesting for me to see her recognize that loss of the single wage earner household as something that was so important to the, let's not say like destruction of the family, let's just say like development of the family, because like it is one thing, as you say, to try and put forward this like teleological view of the development of capitalism, but it is also another thing, and this is frequently a hard line to toe, it's another thing to just describe how things have happened without falling into the trap of being like, well, this is how they happened, so this was the only way they could have happened. Like, this is how she's describing that is how things did develop, you know what I mean? And again, one of the key determinants there was just how capitalism has just impoverished workers so much that the family has kind of had to be disrupted,
Mm-hmm. But there is also like, she does seem to acknowledge the space that's going to be stepped into by the capitalist state in sort of like taking on some of these responsibilities, because she already seems to recognize like there's levels of education that are going to become offered by the state and levels of support to some extent. So it sort of feels like in places what she's, and this is not necessarily a critique actually, but like it feels like a lot of her solutions are in some ways a development of what she can recognize the capitalist state might choose to do in terms of like taking responsibility for educating and caring for children and finding professionals to do that role, right? Like she's advocating for there being workers who raise children, educate children, do all of the house cleaning and all of the cooking, and which is in some respects like where capitalism has gotten to now. It's created an economy where a lot of people can't afford to pay that person to do that level of child rearing so that they're able to go to work, as you were just describing, kind of thing. But there is an extent to which also in this where she seems to be suggesting that there is a value to capitalism, or the version of capitalism that she is observing. There's a value to that form of capitalism in depriving families of this sort of basic unit, all as a way to basically just keep workers dependent on the wage. And in some respects, actually, that's what's happened, right? Like workers are dependent on the wage. All of the kind of like aspects of social care that used to be done by the family become commodities, which then you just sort of buy with the wage that you earn. Obviously, the economy is such a mess that's not, most people don't have the money necessary to do that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess that sort of, to some extent, that just comes back to the kind of like process she's recognizing capitalism doing, and sort of communism was almost stepping into that void and doing a better job of it, kind of thing, which I don't necessarily disagree with, right? I think I would agree that what I would like to see is all of that non-commodity work being recognized as social labor alongside all other work that anybody else does, and that being incorporated into our understanding of what the economy is, kind of thing. So there is a sort of like a form of a process of developing communist economy that we would recognize, that's also being advocated in this, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, you always run the risk when you point to these things that capitalism has done as like, well, we want to finish the job as socialist, right? You always run the risk of that kind of being diluted by just capitalist social relations, because again, it's not so much that we want to like finish the job that capitalism's done. Like, the job that we want to finish that capitalism did it pretty much finished that like several hundred years ago, and that's just socializing production. You know what I mean? I know that it's like happened at different places over different time, but it's like pretty much everything else we can kind of just figure out on our own as people who are like consciously deliberating over a collective political project. But it is interesting. I mean, you know, I think we probably spoke about this way back when we read the endnotes piece, the one on family abolishment, because that piece kind of gets into a bit more of the like, and what does this mean for like queer liberation struggles, questioning of gender, and all of that. And I think that's an interesting point because there's always like debates around the relationship of like trans rights to socialism, right? Where it's a question of now, you know, in the past 50 years, specifically in the last 20 years, I suppose, you know, where we are like now that we're starting to see much larger, more organized movements about questioning gender roles that are assigned for, you know, you get assigned a gender role at birth and you're supposed to play it out. And it's just people like questioning that as it relates to, again, like the entirety of social labor. Like, has that kind of questioning happened because of capitalism or has it happened in spite of capitalism? And it's kind of a similar question to what Kollontai is working with here. And I think it's one that can never really be answered by the kind of typical social democracy angle merger theory stuff in its most orthodox roots, where it's like, well, we just need to come in with our correct ideas and make everything that capitalism has done teleologically more rational. I think it's much more of a question of like really trying to place class struggle as the kind of like thing that if we want to have a teleological view of history where there are certain things that are more progressive, like questioning gender roles, like questioning, you know, well, do we need to have a nuclear family dynamic at all? Can we all just collectively reproduce society? Like, you know, those questions I think do need to have class struggle at their core because, like, at the end of the day, like, workers aren't idiots. Workers are able to consciously think about things in capitalism and act against them. And the kind of like material circumstances that we're given as political actors certainly do determine to a large extent what's possible and what movements get the most shrift or whatever. But at the end of the day, it is still people making decisions to do these things. I don't know if I'm really being super coherent. I think I'm just kind of trying to respond to like Kollontai like, you know, approach to how we as socialists approach things, as how we as socialists approach things that capitalism has done that we can point to as progressive, but that is done for like the wrong reasons and how we relate to those as socialists, right? It's like, you know, just by recognizing, I guess, that class struggle and acting against capitalism has as much to do with these things that are nominally progressive as the material circumstances of capitalism. I don't know if that makes sense. Don't know if I hold to that. I don't know. I'm spitting.
I mean, but like, but that sort of like you raising the question of the process of class struggle creating what these new arrangements are going to be is quite important to put in place because yeah, I mean, this is the point. I think this is the point that you're making, right? Like, it's not about, and again, this is similar to what we came across when we were reading that piece on decadence, right? It's not about the mechanistic economic development of capitalism. It's about how human beings resist that and reforge and reshape their social relations in ways that are in some ways undetermined and in some ways like just in line with the kind of social world that they want to create and live in and exist in. And so like, and then I guess in this piece, there is quite a lot of that. It's just, I found that it was sort of like hidden behind declarations about what the communist state will give you kind of thing. Rather than, I suppose, I don't know, like freeing the space for human beings to work out how they would like to live. But, you know, that's probably an unfair critique. I don't know. She's clearly like she's also described. I mean, there are elements at the end of this piece, for example, right, where she's talking about just relationships between human beings in general, right? And this is the same. This is true of any aspect of a liberated society, right? But if you remove from people's lives the burdens that prevent them from seeking full actualization, whatever that would mean, then they are going to hopefully like develop and actualize themselves in a way which can't be predicted. And one of the things she speaks quite highly of is the relationship between human beings, and like developing new relationships of care and nurture, and I don't know, like that. Yeah, that will be able. Well, we will be able to do if we remove from people's lives all the burdens placed upon them by having to live in a class society. But yeah. So
Yeah. Well,
she's not
again,
immune to this. It's not a
yeah. Well, I mean, again, it just gets back to the idea that it's like her, like all the other Bolsheviks, were engaged in a political project. And it wasn't so much that they were like, we're smart and everyone's stupid. It's that they were the ones, when this was written, actively fighting like the largest war the world had ever seen, other than World War One. You know what I mean? Kind of just a continuation of that. And so, like, actively were put into this role of a kind of like paternal figure to the working class, and perhaps not so much one that is like organically part of it, at least as it developed. But I do think you're right, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, because there are parts of this that definitely feel like she's placing the role of the communist as people who kind of like manage this subsumption into a new mode of production, which on one hand I actually like. I find that quite an attractive idea. Maybe this is just like the best parts of merger theory stuff that I do kind of still like, because, like, there are always going to be parts of our class that are more engaged in actively fighting a class struggle, right? That's fine. I don't think anybody would say anything different there. And there is part of me that does appreciate a kind of view towards whatever the Communist Party winds up looking like as this organization that kind of does its best to manage this transition into a new mode of production. And if we give her all of the if we read this in the kindest possible way, she is kind of just saying that that is what the Bolsheviks are out to do. That's what this new communist state is out to do. That it's basically just out to, like, we recognize the way things are going, so we're going to make it easy for women to get divorced. Like, that's one of the things she brings up right at the beginning, to be like, here's something that we can do to recognize where there is a kind of class struggle, where there is this revolutionary momentum, and kind of like free it. Now, they're freeing that revolutionary energy directly into just a bigger labor pool for the Soviet factories. But, again, this is how they thought communism was going to develop. So, to a certain extent, you can't really blame them. You can very much blame them. But it's an interesting approach, I guess. This idea of the communist movement as the movement that kind of like attempts to politically and socially clear the way for these struggles to be able to kind of like run their course, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like there is a bleak version of this that you read it and it's it's like, like, I mean, fair play. Okay. Like, your house can be better cleaned by a professional cleaner. So we'll just have a group of workers that do that form of social work rather than you having to maintain your house, and you can go off to work and somebody else will do that. But then it extends further to like, maybe children can be better cared for by a professional carer than they can by their parents, and they'll be better educated by the teachers. And there's one point in this where she talks about like raising good socialist citizens of like, I mean, which is not in and of itself wrong perhaps, but like it just felt like if you have a full professionalization of everything, it reads as very grey, sort of like barracks communist kind of thing.
Well, it reads as what it wound up becoming, unfortunately.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, and I guess this is why so many people are so, careful around social democracy based politics, where it's like, okay, everything that we do winds up being based around this party. What happens if it, winds up divorcing itself intentionally or unintentionally from the actual interests of the class, right? Like, how do you merge those two things? Because it hasn't been done successfully in the past. You know what I mean? Because it's like, in the past, we've spoken about how cool it is that like the Austrian social democrats had like hiking clubs and, like weird bizarro Olympics that ran alongside the actual Olympics that were like communist Olympics that everybody came together to like not compete in, which is kind of funny. And it's like, all of that stuff is very, very cool, but exactly like what you're saying, like, there is always the worry that, just with the way that these systems operate, okay, now you've like subsumed the entirety of everyone's lives too. And now, as you're saying, like the basic elements of reproducing a society to this kind of like, master or whatever. It's like, okay, well, that's actually the opposite of what we want. So maybe here we actually have the conversation about how she uses the word state, because I did think this was very interesting. I think in The State and Revolution, Lenin is pretty much just using the word the phrase the state in like a pretty bad way, in a way that really misunderstands what it's supposed to mean in a transition to a new mode of production. One that's less of like a governing apparatus and one that's more of a like, well, we know how to, leave it to us kind of thing, right? Which again, fair enough. Russian Civil War, whatever. But here she's trying to, I think, use it in two different ways. And that's kind of to her credit, but also not really to her credit. She is, at the end of the day, we do have to recognize, writing a piece of propaganda, as you say. So she is still kind of like trying to hold to a party line and justify events as they're in motion. But there are two ways that she uses the word the state here, which is, I mentioned this right at the beginning, where she talks about how, all this stuff is going to be done by the communist state. We're all going to, collectively reproduce society, and it's all going to be done under the thumb of the communist state. But then towards the end, she starts using the phrase the state to just basically just mean like people getting together, to like collectively reproduce society in a very progressive way, or in a way that isn't necessarily hinting at, the authoritarian state that wound up like existing, right? It's an interesting one. It's like, maybe we just need a different word, because it's like, you can use the word the state to mean any number of things. And here I think she's using it in two very different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't actually pick up on that sort of like two meaning distinction toward the end of this piece, but it doesn't surprise me at all, because the first time it appears is actually in a kind of like discussion of what I might call like the feudal or the early modern form of the family, right? Where she's talking about a scenario in which, okay, so the man does quite a lot of the quote unquote work, and I feel like it's almost painting a picture where at this point in this stage of history that she's describing, the male breadwinner is still a wage laborer to some extent. So we might be in a kind of like early modern, early capitalist version of familial relations rather than a fully industrialized one. But she then talks about women's work being in the household and being like caring and cleaning and cooking, but also including stuff what she describes, I think, as being useful to the state, which was quite. It took me aback, that kind of use of language. What's going on here? Because she's talking about like productive work, I suppose, in the sense that like spinning cloth or like making things in the household, which are either like potentially things that are going to be for sale and therefore commodities, but I think more so in this context, it's just like items of utility that are for the household, for the family, things which once we develop into capitalism will become commodities that are bought on the market. And once everybody in the family is a wage laborer, those things will be bought as commodities rather than being something that's produced internal to the family unit. But she's making this interesting distinction between like it being like women's work in this context being some kind of like something social as opposed to private. It's not just like tending a private space. It's something that contributes to the, I don't know, I suppose even just child rearing and feeding children and a husband and stuff is like useful to society and benefit society. But I do feel like she's painting a picture of a different type of social work, which is done by women in this sort of like late feudal, early modern portrayal of the family, something which is destroyed by the onset of industrialization. It also raises the point that like there's something very unstaged about our understanding of the development of the family, because it sort of seems to develop through few. It's the same process playing out through early stages of capitalism, through industrialization, and into like late capitalist, early, hypothetical socialist form of production. There aren't these like hard distinctions between how the family operates in distinct modes of production. There's something more transitional and evolutionary about this description, which seems quite like intellectually refined, I suppose, or interesting to me, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to point out, I think. And I think from hearing you describe it, like it just seems to be a description as well of the element of class struggle that is the thread that goes through all class societies and not just capitalism, right? It's like, where there are inequalities, there is always going to be struggle, whether that's, you're a slave on a latifundia in like Gaul in 200, or, you're like you're a woman that's like been told all throughout history that like, oh no, actually you just kind of stay in the house and you do all the diaper changing and shit. It's like, there's always going to be an element of that inequality and the struggle against it rubbing up against whatever material structures it finds itself in. And that is a much better way of understanding things than a kind of like purely vulgar materialist reading of capitalism has done these things. It's an understanding that like this is a constant process all throughout history. And she is very good, I would say, at the very beginning of kind of recognizing, to kind of like, again, go back to this idea of assuaging people's fears over these bizarre changes that are happening in Soviet society. She's very good at just laying out right at the beginning and saying, look, there isn't a single custom, a single tradition, a single way of doing things that is set in stone and that is unchanging. Like all of this stuff is constantly changing and it will always change. So you can't kind of like look at all of these women running around St. Petersburg wearing pants, and being like pearl. Yeah, exactly. And like pearl clutch. It's like things are changing. We can quibble with like the Bolsheviks, reading of developmentalism or whatever, but like things are changing. And she's just very good at understanding that history is dynamic, I suppose, Mm.
Mm. I guess there's a sort of like a phased understanding of her argument, her conception of a historical development of the family, where like she talks about this early modern family still having productive elements, and whereas when we get into industrialization and capitalism, the family unit is purely consumptive in some ways. So there's this process of I suppose, her development toward full capitalism in her understanding, and this is probably true, is like this, obviously, as we've described, this eradication of production in the household, I guess, and it moving toward everything being industrially produced, everything being a commodity which is bought by wage earners. So then she sort of creates this she describes this new phase of history where the kind of like the housework done by women is something that's often done alongside being a wage laborer, and it's very like, it's cooking and cleaning and sort of those elements of housework. And I guess her argument is that socialism will socialize those things as well, right? Like capitalism has kind of like socialize those productive elements of things that used to happen in the household, but now like, yeah, socialism will do the cleaning for you. And I mean, the more interesting, I mean, the more like there's a discussion in this of like communal kitchens, and that kind of thing. So you could take a reading of this which is not like the soulless eradication of the family so that they can go and be good factory workers, but like a development of the social, so it's like taken away from being something that's purely centered on a nuclear family and something which is more nebulous and created socially, and includes like communal cooking and eating and like, yeah, because maybe in my earlier critiques I've got sort of like it's almost like a process whereby everything, if I'm reading in my negative reading of this, what's happening is everybody's becoming a kind of like waged worker, and all of the formerly sort of like care work done by the family unit, primarily by women, becomes something which is done by a waged worker. But of course, like in a full and proper transition out of capitalism toward a class of society, sure, work will be remunerated in some way and managed in some way, but it's all going to be part of the social. There's not going to be this distinction between, potentially anyway, this distinction between the public and the private, or the yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling.
The gender spheres. There will be no distinction between the gender spheres. I mean, gets to like, a critique of gender that there are many other people who would make these points much more eloquently, but it's a very interesting one where it just gets into a question of what social labor actually is. And as socialists, like if we're sitting down, if you were ever given the task of, okay, write down every job that needs to be done so that we can all come back here tomorrow, and do the same thing all over again to reproduce society. Like that would very obviously include quote unquote housework and quote unquote like care work and all these different things. But capitalism has such a weird, ever changing, very negative relationship to this type of thing that like, you know, it's hard not to see these in very gendered terms, even as that like, distinction is going away, because it's like in the same way that where we've spoken about, capitalism to the greatest extent possible in the interior core is always trying to offshore jobs to try and find cheaper places to produce, to try and find cheaper ways, cheaper labor forces, et cetera, et cetera. In the same way that it's not able to offshore like construction or house cleaning or something like that. So it just creates like, in America specifically, it like racializes these jobs so that you can then have a class of people that you pay less. Very similar thing happens with gender, where it's just like, okay, you can't really like capitalism doesn't really see an opportunity for surplus value creation in quote unquote housework. So for a long time, it was just like it just adopted the something similar to the gender relations of previous modes of production, which was just okay, just have this different class of people that we call women, just do it, right? And you know, I think socialist thought around this subject has developed quite a bit. I think that there's the very interesting like wages for housework stuff where it's like, well, it would all be solved if we could just give, housewives a wage. And it's like, well, not really, because like it's not so much that capitalism wasn't allowing for social reproduction. It was just, giving the guy the wage to then just completely control the family. So it's like, you still be capitalist subjects in that sense anyways. But I don't know. It's just very interesting. And I think this gets into like why organizers definitely need to engage with this stuff, because specifically this essay is such a good example of maybe some ways not to do this, at least in terms of the Bolshevik political project, because it's like, okay, you're a communist organizer. You can look at the world and see that there are all of these horrible inequalities and that there's a rational way that things should be done. But unless a class is ready for those things and is able to carry out the political action necessary to like, abolish those things once and for all, it's not going to work. Like you can't really just come in and be like, do this, do that. It's a very fine line though, because you do want to do things like open up space for, workers to figure out stuff like this on their own. Like when she starts talking about, so we made it easy to get a divorce. It's like, okay, well, there you go. Like now you're not just forcing like people to not get married. You're not like forcibly breaking up people, forcibly breaking up families and like taking children away from people to be raised as good communists. It's like, okay, there's an action that can be taken that is much less paternalistic, that is much more like it's I don't know, it's more of a nudge, if that makes sense. It's just interesting. It's like, as organizers, how do you relate to very obvious inequality? It's like, even if you were put in a position like the Bolsheviks, you would still have to think about this very carefully to kind of like maintain class support for your project, I guess is all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I was thinking about then when you were talking was the idea of like, to some extent, like how commodities function, how the prices of commodities are set, and how capitalism doesn't really create the right number of commodities to meet need, but rather is sort of chasing profitability kind of thing. So obviously, like the setting of prices of the labor that becomes wage labored care work is sort of determined by all these things, and like importation of migrant labor to fulfill this role is one of these things. So I guess the capitalist process is just making these things social in a capitalist sense, but what that exposes them to is the I guess the anarchy of the market, I suppose, and like the way that capitalism sets the price of things. But also, I guess I was thinking a little bit about sort of models for how to organize a socialist economy, and I was thinking about a sort of labor token system. Basically, I was thinking about, okay, how do the Soviets actually intend to plan this system? How do they know they're going to have the right amount of cleaners to do this kind of social work, and how is it going to be remunerated in a way that a system that's the same as the remuneration, or the how are we going to sort of like calculate what that labor means and how it is actually read as being part of the full total process of production, which the kind of like wages for housework thing doesn't quite capture, right? Like you're still recognizing something as being I don't know. Yeah, well, maybe wages for housework could mean that, right? It could mean a incorporation of that kind of reproductive work into broader economy in a way which it can be then seen as equivalent. But yeah, I guess that's the question for socialists is, you know, if
Yeah,
Yana
I mean,
Pell
again,
managed
it
to get
gets
his vote
in.
to Lenin, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, if only he listened to Yanapel, everything would have been fine. I mean, again, it gets back to that question of like, how do you relate to the class if you perceive your project as something slightly independent of it? I mean, any communist political project is going to have to deal with this to a certain extent. I suppose what you do is you begin that project by recognizing that you're not in high communism immediately, and you allow for things like you open up a bunch of communal kitchens so that people have the uh, option to not have to like immediately cook for everybody as soon as they come home from work every day, and that frees up time for that. And then that slowly snowballs. You do that for laundry, you do that for you open up communal living places, like then that snowballs into something different, right, where it's like suddenly you have people like questioning these roles, and it happens in an organic fashion. I guess that's just the role of organizers, right, is to find these spaces where there is this conflict and open up spaces for people to question it, like, and not just like ideologically question it, but like materially question it. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, communal kitchens, very much in favor. We do need to nationalize Weatherspoons, Dan. We do need to do that. Dude, I went to a Weatherspoons the other day. I had a pizza. This was probably a few months ago. And I was so bloated afterwards that like my body was misshapen. I like saw my reflection in a window walking back, and I was like, what the fuck what was in that pizza? Kind of just tasted like cardboard.
Was it? Okay. It wasn't just the cheese.
Well, well, that's the question. That's the question. All right. Well, I mean, anything else on this? I did appreciate how at the end she was kind of like, and this great proletarian family is kind of the way that she describes the state, and perhaps some of her less problematic instances of describing the state. I like how she was like, once we start to collectively reproduce society, this will make people actually start to care about other people's kids, which is kind of a funny thing. It's kind of a funny way to put it. She basically phrases this like, you'll no longer only care about getting your kid fed and being like, who gives a fuck if that kid freezes? Like, my kid's fine. That's a very funny way to phrase it, but the overall point is very good. It's like, frequently we're very like, as Marxists, maybe like hard-nosed, focusing on the factory elements of production, right? The agriculture and all of this stuff. But it's a very good point that it's like, we don't want to we're always in danger of viewing the reproduction of society in those terms, whereas reproduction, like that way of thinking about things is very capitalist in its nature, right? Like the reproduction of society necessarily includes making sure everybody has a like safe and healthy upbringing. And I liked this utopian vision that she was putting forward of communal kitchens, of caring about everybody else, about kids becoming good communist subjects. Like, I like it, is all I'm saying, I guess.
Yes. The Marxist Sunday school that they're all going to go to.
Yeah, and not do their reading for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, now I know it all.
How do you do it? Like, if all of your state leaders have like beards and mustaches, what do you draw on the faces of the people in your textbooks? I don't know.
So you draw them cleanly shaven. That's funny.
Hey. Well, on that note.
On that note, this is good. You're right. I think you've opened my eyes definitely to like certain critiques of this piece, but overall, this is definitely stuff that people need to engage with, and this is a piece that's worth reading for the critiques as well as for actual pragmatic questions that you will be having in any revolutionary situation. And it's again, like, I don't want to open this back up, but it is just very interesting to see the ways in which our circumstances now are both the same in many ways and also quite different. Like, now it's not even that states are taking over responsibility from capitalists, for the collective reproduction of society. All we're getting is 2-pound buses. You know what I mean? Like, there's not really much of that going on anymore.
And,
so it's like
the privatization of schools.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and the NHS. Now it's very much we're probably dealing with questions that are much more familiar to the longue durée of capitalism, as opposed to the kind of like post-war compromise, like, there's a welfare state, don't worry about it if you can't pay for daycare. Like, yeah. It's an interesting one.
I mean, it raises that question about like capitalists no longer being interested in the reproduction of the workforce necessarily. You know, if there is sufficient reserve army, or you know, if the number of people necessary, the number of workers, if there are too many workers, kind of thing. You know, the capitalist might the capitalist state loses interest in having to take on the responsibility of social reproduction, I guess, which is, you know,
interest and ability.
We can be seeing. Yeah.
Hence another reason that the kind of typical social democracy thing perhaps should be called into question. But what are you gonna do? All right. Well, let's hope we get a better alternative before we have to figure out how we're going to pay for childcare. Let's have this revolution happen in the next 6 months, please.
6 months till the revolution.
Please run a countdown here.
6 months and however long it takes for Jack's baby to be born.
Yeah. To figure, I mean, she's getting a job as soon as you're fucking a job. You know what I mean?
Hey, look, the critique of the Gotha program says you need to go in the workplace to learn good proletarian subjectship. You know,
that's so sad. Like, take the baby to work, and just like, oh, so you should slack is what I'm learning about social production. I see.
Hey, maybe you just need to take the baby to work.
Take the baby to work. Yeah, honestly. Yeah. Sure,
she'll be fine.
Yeah, she'll figure it out. All right. Well, Dan, we will be back at some point.
Yeah. With something
It'll be great. Yeah. We'll figure with something good. Yeah. Hey, let us know. What should we read? And we're probably not going to have the opportunity like we always do when we have these breaks where, let's read a book. Let's read a book over that period. And then we both like frantically read it the day before.
Yeah. Probably be another short have to accept. I just need to accept. This is what you get, guys. I'm sorry. Hey.
Exactly.
Wow.
Hey, man.
Thanks once again, Jack.
Talk to you soon. No. There will be another one of us when we restart. Yay. So a third mic. Yeah, I need daycare for podcasting. You know what I mean? Is that going to be in the social plan under communism? All right. Whatever. Thank you very much, Dan. We'll be back soon.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.